On April 27, 1296, the Scottish army stood on a hillside near Dunbar Castle in southeastern Scotland and watched the English army approach with the confidence of men who believed terrain gave them victory. The Scots numbered approximately 10,000 soldiers, including most of Scotland's nobility, earls, barons, and knights, who had rebelled against English overlordship and deposed their own king, John Balliol, replacing him with a council of nobles. They held the high ground on Spott Muir, a slope that would force the English to attack uphill, a tactical advantage that should have made them difficult to defeat. Below them approached the English army commanded by John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, with roughly 12,000 men, including 3,000 heavy cavalry and Welsh longbowmen. The Scots expected a brutal but winnable battle, where their defensive position would negate English cavalry superiority. What they got instead was a catastrophic rout that lasted perhaps 3 hours, where 10,000 Scottish soldiers were killed or captured, where Scotland's entire military nobility was enslaved or imprisoned, where the Scottish kingdom effectively ceased to exist as an independent state, and where King Edward I of England, called Longshanks and the Hammer of the Scots, achieved in one afternoon what would normally require years of campaigning: the complete subjugation of Scotland. But the victory was so complete and so brutal that it planted the seeds of resistance, creating the conditions that would produce William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, and decades of savage warfare that would ultimately lead to Scottish independence. On this day in 1296, England crushed Scotland so thoroughly that it guaranteed Scotland would fight back with unprecedented ferocity. To understand how the Battle of Dunbar became such a one-sided slaughter, you must understand the political chaos that preceded it. Scotland in the 1290s was in a succession crisis. King Alexander III had died in 1286, and his heir, the Maid of Norway, died in 1290 before reaching Scotland, leaving no clear successor. Multiple claimants competed for the throne, the most prominent being John Balliol and Robert Bruce the Elder, grandfather of the future Robert the Bruce. The Scottish nobles, unable to resolve the dispute themselves, made a fatal mistake. They asked King Edward I of England to arbitrate. Edward was one of medieval Europe's most formidable rulers, a brilliant general who had conquered Wales and built a network of massive stone castles to control it. He saw the Scottish succession crisis as an opportunity to assert English overlordship over Scotland. Edward agreed to arbitrate on the condition that all claimants acknowledge him as Lord Paramount of Scotland, essentially making Scotland a vassal state. The desperate Scottish nobles agreed. Edward chose John Balliol as king in 1292, but Balliol was a weak ruler dominated by both Edward and the Scottish nobility. For 4 years, Balliol ruled as Edward's puppet, but in 1295, the Scottish nobles, humiliated by English demands for military service in France, rebelled. They deposed Balliol in all but name, creating a council of 12 nobles to rule Scotland, and formed an alliance with France against England, the beginning of the Auld Alliance. This was open rebellion against English overlordship. Edward I's response was immediate and overwhelming. In March 1296, he assembled the largest army England had fielded in decades, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 men, including heavy cavalry, infantry, and Welsh longbowmen, and invaded Scotland. Edward's strategy was total war: conquer Scotland completely, crush all resistance, and impose direct English rule. His army crossed the border and marched to Berwick upon Tweed, Scotland's largest and wealthiest town. What happened at Berwick was a deliberate atrocity designed to terrorize Scotland into submission. Edward's forces stormed the town on March 30th, 1296, and Edward ordered a massacre. Contemporary chronicles claim between 7,000 and 17,000 civilians were killed over 3 days. Men, women, children, anyone the English soldiers found was slaughtered. The streets ran with blood. Bodies were piled in the marketplace. Churches were not respected as sanctuary. Priests and worshippers were killed at altars. Edward personally supervised the massacre, reportedly watching from horseback as his troops murdered Scottish civilians. The slaughter only ended when Edward saw a woman giving birth being killed by an English soldier, and, in a moment of conscience or perhaps just disgust, ordered the killing to stop. Berwick was a message. Resistance to England meant extermination. The psychological impact on Scotland was profound. Towns across southern Scotland surrendered immediately when they heard what happened at Berwick. But the Scottish nobility, humiliated and enraged, gathered their forces and prepared to resist. The Scottish army assembled at Dunbar Castle in late April 1296. Dunbar was a strategic stronghold on the North Sea coast, and its castle was held by the Countess of Dunbar, whose husband was fighting for the Scots, but whose loyalty to Scotland was apparently questionable. The Scottish force numbered approximately 10,000, but this was not an army of common soldiers. This was Scotland's military elite, the Earls of Atholl, Ross, Menteith, and others, with their household knights and retainers. These were men who had fought in France, in the Crusades, who owned vast estates and commanded feudal levies. They were experienced warriors in expensive plate armor riding war horses. They believed that their defensive position on the slopes of Spott Muir, combined with their martial skill, would allow them to defeat the English even though they were slightly outnumbered. They did not understand that Edward I had revolutionized medieval warfare during his Welsh campaigns, developing combined arms tactics that integrated heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, and Welsh longbowmen into a system that could break any traditional feudal army. The Scots were about to learn this lesson in the most brutal way possible. On April 27, 1296, the Earl of Surrey led the English army toward Dunbar. Surrey was an experienced commander, over 60 years old, who had fought in the Crusades and various English campaigns. He was Edward's most trusted general, and Edward had given him clear orders: destroy the Scottish army and capture the nobility. Surrey studied the Scottish position on the hillside and recognized the tactical challenge. A direct uphill assault against a prepared enemy was exactly the kind of attack that medieval military doctrine said would fail. Cavalry charging uphill loses momentum. Infantry attacking uphill arrives exhausted. But Surrey had advantages the Scots didn't anticipate. His army included Welsh longbowmen who could shoot uphill effectively, and his cavalry was better trained and equipped than the Scottish horse. More importantly, Surrey recognized that the Scots had made a critical error. They had positioned themselves with their backs to difficult terrain, including the Spott Burn ravine, which would make retreat difficult if the battle turned against them. Surrey decided to attack anyway, gambling that English discipline and firepower could overcome the terrain disadvantage. He deployed his Welsh longbowmen to the front and ordered them to begin shooting at the Scottish positions to provoke the Scots into attacking downhill, where English cavalry could hit them in open ground. It was the same tactical approach that would be used successfully at Falkirk 2 years later, and at Crecy 50 years later. The battle began with Welsh longbowmen shooting volleys of arrows at the Scottish positions on the hillside. The Scots had some archers of their own, but they were outranged and outmatched by the Welsh longbows. As arrows began hitting Scottish troops, the Scottish commanders faced a choice: stay on the defensive and be shot at, or charge downhill and engage the English before more casualties accumulated. The Scottish nobility, confident in their cavalry and eager to prove their martial valor, made the fatal decision to charge. Thousands of Scottish knights and men-at-arms on horseback began riding down the slope toward the English lines. This was exactly what Surrey wanted. A cavalry charge downhill gains momentum but becomes difficult to control, and when it hits an enemy formation, the attackers often become disordered. The Scottish cavalry charged into the English lines with significant force, breaking through the initial English infantry formations. For a brief moment, it appeared the Scots might win. But Surrey had held his heavy cavalry in reserve, and now he ordered them to countercharge. 3,000 English heavy cavalry, fresh and disciplined, hit the disordered Scottish cavalry in a devastating counterattack. The collision was catastrophic for the Scots. English knights in full plate armor on powerful war horses smashed into Scottish cavalry that was already disorganized from their charge. The Scottish line buckled, then broke. What happened next was not a battle, but a slaughter. The Scottish cavalry routed, fleeing back up the hill toward their infantry, with English cavalry in pursuit. The Scottish infantry, seeing their cavalry destroyed and fleeing, panicked and began to retreat as well. But retreat was nearly impossible because the Scots had positioned themselves with the Spott Burn ravine behind them. This ravine was a steep-sided stream crossing that could not be crossed quickly, especially not by thousands of fleeing soldiers. The retreating Scots became trapped between the pursuing English cavalry and the ravine. English knights rode through the packed Scottish formations, cutting down fleeing men from behind. Soldiers who reached the ravine tried to cross, fell into the water, and drowned, weighed down by armor. Others were trampled by their own comrades. The English cavalry showed no mercy, systematically hunting down and killing fleeing Scots. Contemporary chronicles describe the pursuit lasting for miles, with English knights chasing individual Scottish soldiers across the countryside and killing them. The battlefield and surrounding area became a killing field. Bodies littered the slopes of Spott Muir, choked the Spott Burn ravine, and lay scattered for miles along the escape routes. The scale of Scottish casualties at Dunbar was catastrophic. Contemporary English sources claim 10,000 Scots were killed, though this is likely an exaggeration. Modern historians estimate between 3,000 and 7,000 killed, with another 3,000 to 5,000 captured, meaning the Scottish army was completely destroyed. But the real disaster was not the casualty numbers, it was who was captured. Scotland's entire military nobility was taken prisoner. The Earls of Atholl, Ross and Menteith were captured. Over 100 Scottish knights and barons were taken. These men represented Scotland's political and military leadership. Their capture meant Scotland had no organized resistance left. The English treated these prisoners not as honorable captives to be ransomed, as was customary in medieval warfare, but as rebels and traitors. Edward I ordered them imprisoned in England, many in brutal conditions. Some were held in irons and castle dungeons. Others were displayed in humiliating public processions. The Earl of Atholl and others were eventually executed for treason, hanged, or beheaded. This was not chivalric warfare. This was political subjugation through terror and humiliation. The captured Scottish nobles were essentially enslaved, their estates seized, their families dispossessed. Scotland's aristocracy was destroyed in one afternoon. English casualties at Dunbar were minimal, perhaps 100 to 200 killed or wounded. The battle had been so one-sided that it barely qualified as combat. It was more accurately described as a rout followed by a massacre. The Earl of Surrey reported to Edward I that the battle had been a complete victory with trivial English losses. Edward, who was campaigning elsewhere in Scotland, was delighted. He had achieved his strategic objective, destroying Scottish organized resistance, far more quickly and completely than expected. Over the following weeks, Edward's army marched through Scotland accepting surrenders. Town after town opened their gates without resistance. Castles surrendered rather than face siege. By July 1296, Edward had marched to the far north of Scotland, received submission from Highland chiefs, and declared Scotland conquered. He stripped John Balliol of the Scottish crown and had him imprisoned in England. Edward seized the Stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, and took it to Westminster Abbey in London as a trophy, where it remained for 700 years. He declared Scotland to be directly ruled by English officials. Scotland, as an independent kingdom, had effectively ceased to exist. All of this was possible because of the catastrophic Scottish defeat at Dunbar. But Edward I's conquest, despite its apparent completeness, contained the seeds of its own failure. The brutality at Berwick and the humiliation at Dunbar created a burning desire for revenge in Scotland. The common people, those who had no voice in the decisions that led to war, had watched their nobility surrender or be captured. They had seen English soldiers occupy their country, impose English law, and demand English taxes. This created conditions for a people's resistance, led not by nobles but by commoners. Within a year of Dunbar, William Wallace, a minor Scottish landowner with no noble title, would begin guerrilla warfare against English occupation. Wallace's rebellion would culminate in the stunning Scottish victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297, where Wallace used tactical brilliance to destroy an English army. Wallace would be declared Guardian of Scotland, taking the role that the captured nobles could not fill. Edward's complete victory at Dunbar had eliminated Scotland's traditional leadership, but it had created space for a different kind of leader, one who represented common Scots, not aristocracy. The wars of Scottish independence, which would rage for another 60 years, were born from the ashes of Dunbar. The human cost of Dunbar extended far beyond the battlefield. 3,000 to 7,000 Scottish soldiers killed meant that every community in southern and central Scotland lost men. These were not just nobles and knights, but also common soldiers, men-at-arms, and retainers who came from farms and towns. Their deaths created immediate economic hardship for families who depended on their labor. The capture of over 100 nobles meant that Scottish estates were left without leadership, creating political chaos. The families of captured nobles, wives, children, relatives, were dispossessed of their lands and wealth, which Edward seized and granted to English loyalists or Scottish collaborators. The psychological trauma affected Scotland for generations. Stories of Dunbar and Berwick became part of Scottish national consciousness, evidence of English brutality that justified resistance. When Robert the Bruce eventually won Scottish independence at Bannockburn in 1314, it was explicitly framed as revenge for Dunbar and the years of English occupation that followed. The battle created a cycle of violence and revenge that characterized Anglo-Scottish relations for centuries. The tactical lessons of Dunbar were studied by Edward's commanders and applied in future battles. The combination of longbow archery to provoke enemy attacks, followed by heavy cavalry countercharges, proved devastatingly effective against traditional feudal armies. This tactical system would be refined over the following decades and reach its peak at battles like Crecy and Agincourt, where English longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms would destroy much larger French armies. Dunbar was an early demonstration that the age of cavalry dominance was ending, and that combined arms tactics integrating ranged weapons and disciplined infantry could defeat traditional knightly armies. The Scottish nobility at Dunbar fought according to the traditional rules of medieval warfare: cavalry charges, individual combat, chivalric honor, and were destroyed by an English army that had moved beyond those traditions. It was a preview of how medieval warfare would evolve over the next century, with professional armies replacing feudal levies and tactical innovation trumping individual martial valor. The political consequences of Dunbar lasted for years. Scotland was occupied by English garrisons from 1296 to 1314, a period called the First English Occupation. English officials governed Scotland, English law was imposed, Scottish institutions were dismantled. The Scottish Church, which had been independent, was placed under English control. Scottish wealth was extracted to fund English campaigns in France. This occupation was brutal and exploitative, creating resentment that fueled resistance. William Wallace's rebellion from 1297 to 1305 challenged English control, but was ultimately defeated, with Wallace captured and executed in 1305 in London by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. But Wallace's resistance had kept Scottish hopes alive and prevented England from consolidating control. When Robert the Bruce claimed the Scottish throne in 1306 and began his own rebellion, he built on the foundation Wallace had created. Bruce's eventual victory at Bannockburn in 1314 ended English occupation and secured Scottish independence, but it was a direct response to the occupation that began with Dunbar in 1296. The mythology around Dunbar in Scottish history is complex. Unlike Stirling Bridge or Bannockburn, which are celebrated as heroic victories, Dunbar is remembered as a catastrophic defeat and a moment of national humiliation. This makes it less prominent in popular Scottish historical consciousness, but historians recognize it as perhaps the most important battle of the early wars of Scottish independence, because it set the conditions for everything that followed. The destruction of Scotland's traditional nobility at Dunbar forced Scotland to develop new forms of leadership and new military tactics. It demonstrated that Scotland could not defeat England in conventional battles with traditional feudal armies, leading to the development of guerrilla warfare and schiltrom formations that would eventually succeed. The battle also revealed Edward I's strategic brilliance but also his brutality, characteristics that would define the Anglo-Scottish wars for decades. Dunbar was not glorious, but it was transformative. The archaeological evidence from Dunbar is limited because the battlefield has been heavily developed and most remains were not preserved. Contemporary sources describe bodies being buried in mass graves near the battlefield, but these have never been located. Some excavation work in the 19th and 20th centuries found scattered medieval weapons and armor fragments consistent with a major battle, but nothing approaching comprehensive evidence. The lack of archaeological data means that many details about the battle, exact troop positions, precise casualty figures, the sequence of events, remain uncertain and debated among historians. What is clear from contemporary chronicles is that the Scottish defeat was complete, the casualties were catastrophic, and the political consequences were immediate and severe. The Battle of Dunbar destroyed Scotland as an independent kingdom in one afternoon, though it would take another 18 years for Scotland to fully recover that independence through Robert the Bruce's campaigns. On April 27, 1296, England's Earl of Surrey routed 10,000 Scots in just a few hours on the slopes of Spott Muir, near Dunbar Castle, killing thousands and capturing Scotland's entire military nobility. King Edward I achieved in one battle what normally required years: the complete subjugation of Scotland. Scottish nobles who had deposed their own king and rebelled against English overlordship were captured, imprisoned, displayed in chains, and in some cases executed as traitors. Scotland's estates were seized, its institutions dismantled, its independence erased. The Stone of Scone was taken to Westminster as a trophy. Scotland was occupied, but the very completeness of Edward's victory created the conditions for resistance. The brutality at Berwick and the humiliation at Dunbar planted seeds of rage in common Scots who would produce leaders like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. The battle was England's greatest triumph in Scotland, but it guaranteed that Scotland would fight back with unprecedented ferocity. Dunbar was not the end of Scottish independence. It was the beginning of the struggle to reclaim it, a struggle that would consume both nations for decades and cost tens of thousands of lives before Scotland finally won freedom at Bannockburn 18 years later. The hammer of the Scots had struck, but Scotland refused to break.